Call the meeting to order. Looks like we have a determination of quorum. We have a quorum. And for the rezoning, so the rezoning hearing, so all those intend to testify or believe that they may testify should stand and be sworn in by the clerk.
Please raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Yes, I do. Be seated.
All right. The petitioner, you have 15 minutes to present your case.
Good evening, Mr. President, members of the council. My name is Russell Brown, an attorney with the law firm of Clark Quinn, Moses, Scott & Grahn at 320 North Meridian Street, Suite 1100 in Indianapolis. I represent the petitioners in this matter, Bob and Kathy Jones, for the requested rezoning for 7113 East 56th Street. The request before you tonight is a request for a limited C1 rezoning. The property at issue here is improved with a single-story residential structure, less than 2,000 square feet under roof, with an attached two-car garage. It sits on the hard corner of Shadeland Way or Cato Drive and 56th Street on the southeast corner. The Jones acquired this property in 2005, with it being utilized residentially through 2011. In 2011, our office worked with the Lawrence Board of Zoning Appeals to obtain a variance of use to allow the Joneses to run their ticket business office out of that location. Since 2011, lots has changed that industry, and it's no longer an active business use for the Jones. They sold that approximately 2 years ago. During their use of the property for this commercial purpose, there were no significant issues between this use and the adjoining property owners. No complaints, no police runs, et cetera, to this location. Since that business ended in 2015, there have been repeated attempts to utilize the property in a residential manner with limited success for some of the reasons I'll talk about in just a moment. Tonight's request is a request to permit the rezoning of this parcel to that C1 classification, the least intense commercial classification in the Indianapolis zoning ordinance. The purpose of the request is relatively simple: to allow the owners to actively market this property for the use of attracting a small commercial user. Instead of doing a different variance each time a new tenant were to be interested in the property, the request tonight before you is for a blanket rezoning to that C1. Prior to filing, we did go through the potential uses in the C1 classification and removed approximately 1/3 of the uses that were permitted as a primary use or accessory or temporary use under the ordinance. We removed those that we believed would require a larger footprint, or those which would be on the more intense side of the C1 classification, or which might serve as a potential attraction or distraction to the high school students and LC traffic located on the north side of 56th Street. This was a voluntary act of the petitioner that we undertook on our own accord. The likely use here is that of an office use, professional office or support office for work done off-site or remotely. Example, potentially a billing office for an off-site user. Upon the successful rezoning of the property, we do have a pending variance related to parking. We would ask that the site operate with 4 marked surface parking spots, all of which can be done on the existing concrete hard surface on the property. So the petitioner does not have any plans to expand or modify the footprint of the building or to expand the hard surface upon the approval of this rezoning request. It would remain largely as it exists today. The staff report from the Indianapolis Planning Department does, just as it did in 2011, is concerned with the commercial creep along 56th Street in compliance with the comp plan. I want to take a few minutes to just talk about some of the unique features of this property, all of which you likely already know, but I think it's important for purposes of tonight's hearing to discuss those. We believe this property is different than almost every other parcel of land in Marion County. We'll talk about why. Start with the information I've already provided to you, that it's on the hard corner, which is signalized, and which on the other 3 corners are somewhat intense uses. You have commercial use to the west, you have the high school to the north, and you have the options property to the northwest. All of those changes and all of this commercial development has occurred since this home was built in the late 1950s. Lawrence Central opened in 1963. 465 was completed in the early 70s. The low single-story office complex and the multifamily was added to the northwest corner in the late 1970s, at which time Shadeland Way was constructed. Early in the 1980s, the commercial building to the west was opened. Early 1990s, the options building was constructed. In the early 2000s, I-465 was reconfigured, bringing out the on-ramp to northbound 465 closer to the intersection. Each of those changes has changed the environment in which this property operates, again, resulting in what we believe is a very unique environment in Marion County. The 56th Street driveway for this property is separated from the signalized 56th Street exit ramp off of northbound 465 by approximately 900 feet of travel in the right-of-way. In Marion County, there are only 16 residentially zoned properties whose driveway is located closer than 900 feet of right-of-way travel from interstate exit ramp. 16. And there is only one residential property which is located next to a signalized intersection with the commercial or special use zoned on all other corners of that intersection. And that's a 4.5 acre parcel at the corner of 10th and High School Road on the west side. Otherwise, they are located along the right-of-way. They're located where there are other residential uses on the other corners or not next to a signalized intersection. In our opinion, that is a dramatic and unique difference at this location that we believe warrants special consideration like we're asking for this evening. Second, it's also important from our vantage point to note that the signalized intersection located here is located along one of the busiest stretches of road in Lawrence. The average daily vehicle count by NDOT in 2016 on this 56th Street stretch was 27,826 vehicles per day. That is the busiest non-Pendleton Pike intersection in the city. That's an important component, again, that shows why this property is different. That's more traffic than is on 79th Street between Fox Road and Fall Creek. It's more than the intersection I travel every day at Pendleton Pike and Sunnyside Road. I think that's an important distinction that is different, that shows that this property is, in fact, different. We believe these factors, when put together, give you some idea of why it's been so difficult for the petitioner to try to find a residential renter for this property. Over the years, the car traffic and foot traffic, and quite frankly, the traffic on foot from some of those folks who hang out at interstate intersections, invariably cut across this yard, heading to that multifamily use south or to the high school or to the interstate interchange. It's made it impossible to retain tenants willing to pay a market rate rental for this property. It is the petitioner's belief that the restricted commercial uses requested by this petition can coexist well with all surrounding uses, including the residential uses to the east and to the south. As each of you are likely familiar with this property, there is a relatively large stand of trees near the 56th Street right-of-way, which allows for a good barrier to the residential property to the east. The external physical changes to the structure will be minimal. The parking will need to be striped, but it will be located on the existing hard surface. There won't be a need to change the driveways to 56th Street or to Shadeland Way that already exist. And the limited size of the facility and limited nature of this request, we believe will have minimum traffic impact at this location. We have spoken with the City of Lawrence administration on this petition, and they have no objections to this request. We believe it is a proper reuse of this structure. While we respect the City of Indianapolis's planning staff concern about commercial creep along 56th Street, we believe the request before you tonight is limited in scope as a proposed change and is also confined to a property of which there are no peers. For these reasons, we'd respectfully request your favorable recommendation of this rezoning petition to the Metropolitan Development Commission, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that any of you have at this time.
Mr. Brown, if I may, the purpose is this property will just be basically an office. and that would be in a C1, zoning. Is there any chance that if the property was sold, that with the C1 zoning, that it could be utilized for anything other than an office?
The C1, the zoning goes with the land, runs with the land, and so the limited zoning ordinance that we're asking to be adopted would be upon that property, no matter who the owner is. So it runs with the land, not with the owner.
Right, but that's, my question is, could it be possible that it could be utilized, the property utilized for anything other than an office if it was in fact sold under C1? I was thinking maybe like possibly a car lot or?
No, that's a C3 or C4.
C3?
Yeah.
Okay.
So C1, again, there's about 36 total temporary accessory or permanent uses. We've eliminated about 12 of those.
Okay.
So there's only a very narrow bandwidth that could be located. Professional office is one of those, both and just office use kind of generally. So you could have a dentist office, you could have accounting office in there, you could have a billing office, medical billing could be something that could be utilized there. So those are the types of uses. We eliminated things like group home, nursing home, some of those things which we thought probably weren't feasible for this corner given the size of the parking that was available, given the size of the structure that exists there. So we tried to limit it to something that was going to be low intensity, but also looking down the road when the Jones may not own it, about what some future owner could want to do there.
Well, I can see your point about the, this particular property has good access from a couple different, from a couple of different ways. I think probably the biggest impact would just be that, that the outside facade of it would change, in some fashion. As long as that wouldn't happen, it would still look like a home, I would take it.
Yeah, I mean, you could have signage. There would be an opportunity to have commercial signage. Obviously, both either wall sign or a freestanding sign would be permitted by C1. But that's limited by, by the length of the right-of-way, and there's other limiting factors to what could be there. But yes, that would probably be the only substantial external change that would be contemplated, would be potential signage.
And that would, but for them to have signage, they would have to come back in front of the variance board, would they not?
No, they would have signage by right as long as it met all the development standards, but it can't, there's a pretty significant setback. The right-of-way comes back pretty far there on the other side of the ditch that's there. That's where the right-of-way line is, so it has to be set back from the right-of-way. It can't be in the clear sight triangle. So it'd have to be set back pretty far. Probably the only place to do it practically without getting a variance and coming back to the BZA would be to be kind of in the front, in the grassy area, kind of in front of the front door.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Mr. President? Okay. Mr. Brown, what about the neighbors? Are they okay with this, or?
I had one call. I take it back. I had two calls. I had a call from the owner of the Options building who asked some questions about what our intended use was. When I explained to him that we were going to a C1 use with some of the restrictions, he didn't have any concerns related to that. And I had a call from the CDC, from Chris Barnett at the CDC, asking what our intended use were. He was more concerned about it being utilized as a drive-through ATM for financial center. That was his concern. So those were the only two contacts that I've had. We did send out, obviously, mailed notice for this petition tonight. We also have the variance as it relates to the parking, and that notice has also been sent out. So the neighbors have gotten two mailed notices in addition to the signage that's been up on the property.
And how many parking spaces?
We would have 4, but the challenge is that you do have a garage here that you can't count for those parking spots. So I think under the ordinance it would be required to have 6, one being a reserved space, a handicap reserved space. So we'll have the handicap reserved space plus 3 spaces.
And is there any problem with the on and off of 56th Street?
No, I mean, those exist today. I've utilized them every time I've gone to post signage over there. And obviously, you can get on off of 56th Street, and you can get back on Shadeland Way to turn east or west.
Mr. President, have you identified a potential
There's been
business?
there's been inquiries. They've been along the lines of what I discussed. Professional offices there've been inquiries, but because the variance that was sought in 2011 and obtained in 2011 was for a ticket sales office, that's the only permitted commercial use in the property currently, and that was actually personal to the Joneses. So there's no opportunity to assign it, but we don't have it can't actively market it because it's not zoned properly currently.
Okay.
Any other councilors? Councilor Rebuttal.
Mr. Brown, so given a petition is for a C1, that's just for the property, so an owner could purchase that property and demolish the building and still be compliant with C1 use?
They could do C1. They would have to, I would tell you under the new ordinance, the C1 requirements. If you knocked down the building and came back, you'd have to meet the green factor. You'd have to meet a lot of other.
But that's a possibility.
That's absolutely a possibility. They would have to comply with all of the zoning ordinance requirements there.
Anyone else? Okay. All right, thank you, Mr. Brown.
Thank you.
All right, the remonstrator have 15 minutes to present their opposition or objections. Any remonstrator? Okay. All right, staff
Mr.
comments?
President, I'm sorry, I think maybe the gentleman back there wanted to speak.
Well, he's not the,
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you, what you said.
The-
If you want somebody to come up with opposition of this, is that
right,
would be?
okay.
Did he sign the sheet?
Sorry, I
Did you sign the sheet?
very well.
He
Did you
stood
sign
up.
the sheet?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
Name
Okay.
and address.
Just state your name and address for the record, please, sir.
Name is Kent L. Hayes, spelled H-A-A-S-E.
Okay.
Address is at 5520 Edloo Place. I've lived in that house since I was 4 years old. My mom recently passed away and I inherited the house. I know my mom has fought this in the past. I'm sorry, I'm a little nervous. I'm not used to coming up and speaking. But I see a lot that goes on right there at that intersection. I can't tell you how many police runs go to Salem Courthouse, go to the old Orchard Apartments, which I think are called 56th Street Place now or something like that. The lights from the finance center shining in my windows at night. The noise from the people's booming radios constantly up and down that street. And I understand that there's a fence around the property, and I understand why you did that. And I understand why my mom did it too, because there are kids that cut through. And we've pretty much put a stop to that. I just think that more traffic and more chaos at that intersection is going to cause a lot of problems. There's probably an accident once a month at that intersection. School kids coming out of that intersection, school buses, people coming from the finance credit union there, all the people coming home from the finance center to get off at 4 o'clock, the same time the kids are coming home from school. I mean, it's crazy. It's crazy right around there. The best thing they did was put in those new speed limit flashing lights. I go up and down that street 10 times a day. I constantly see Lawrence police at Lawrence Central High School. At night, I constantly see Lawrence police at the Finance Center. I've seen fights over there. I've heard gunfire. I've heard gunfire at Salem. I've seen fires. It's gotten bad. And I understand that, they want to do something, but you would think that the commercial would stop right there where it is stopped and not move on in front of the high school. And who knows what else it might bring on down the road. I am to a point now where the chain link fence and the fence that's put up in this yard is not good enough. I have no privacy, none whatsoever. And I'm gonna put a privacy fence up against his fence. That's just a wrought iron type fence. And along my backyard, my neighbor's dog barks constantly. These people don't take care of this dog. Has left him out in the rain for the last week, and it just sits out there and barks and barks and barks constantly. And I know hasn't been anybody living in the house there. They do take care of it. They take good care of the yard. I don't have any issues with that. But like the gentleman said, or lady said earlier, what happens if somebody buys it, wants to tear it down and put something in there? What's going to happen to my property value? I'm getting ready to invest a lot of money in that house. And I've lived in Lawrence all my life. My mom was a Garrison. My aunt was a Tritipo, who practically founded this town. My aunt and uncle were barbers, who at one time owned all the land between 46th and 56th and Shadeland and Franklin Road. It was all farmland. I don't know if any of you here are old enough to remember the round barn that used to sit over off of Shadeland. That was my uncle's farm. Him and his 4 sons built that round barn. I've seen good things happen in Lawrence. I've seen bad things. I'm raising an 18-year-old daughter on my own, have been for the last 10 years. And I just can't see bringing, depending on what kind of business it is, and we really don't know, bringing a business that could possibly bring in, for lack of a better word, more riffraff to the area. Does anybody have any questions? That's really, it's kind of disappointing. I knew the people that was good friends with the guy that grew up in that house, the Sylvesters. Like I said, I've lived there all my life, except for when I was in the Marine Corps.
Yes, sir. I'm sorry, I didn't remember your name. I didn't get a chance to write it down.
Kent Hayes.
Kent?
Kent Hayes, last name spelled Haase.
And yeah, I do remember that barn.
Yeah.
I've been around a day or two myself.
Yeah.
Well,
I was 4. We had to move when 465 was built.
yeah,
And we bought that house, my mom and dad bought that house new. It was built, I think, in 63 or something like that.
yeah, it was in the early 60s. I totally sympathize with your concerns and with the problems you're having with the neighborhood. I guess my question is and here, I'm not trying to criticize, I'm just trying to understand. But if there was a office in this property, and or some kind of a business that operates an office, and I could possibly see the possibility of maybe a bad neighbor. However, I would think maybe an office would be like an 8 to 5 thing, not necessarily, but I would think maybe most likely.
Well, from what I've heard from the past, it's gonna be ticket sales, and that's probably not gonna be an 8 to 5 thing. That's gonna be people coming in after 5, because most people can't get away from work. Me, I worked 11, 12-hour days most of the time. I'm lucky I was even able to make this meeting. I worked for Tremaine Tile, Marble, and Granite. Have for quite a few years.
Well, I guess my concern for you and, well, for any of us for that matter, is you really can't pick your neighbors, you know, I mean, if the house was to stay residential and you got a neighbor that had, you know, for say the dog, you know, had another dog that barked all the time, I'm not, you know, how do you control that? You know, that,
Like I said, I'm putting up a privacy fence.
yeah, and that's your solution. I mean, I've got a privacy fence and the kids behind me, they stick sticks through the slats in it to
Well,
poke my dog and
really
throw
don't
things
have any
over the
kids.
fence.
But,
But I mean, I totally understand what you're saying, but I'm not sure I understand, whether it be a commercial, you know, whether it be a commercial neighbor or it be a, you know, a residential neighbor, that maybe you could end up with a bad neighbor, possibly either way.
you know, I really doubt it, because the house is a very nice house.
Yeah, it is.
Another thing is, I can't even tell you if or when I've ever seen a for sale sign out in that front yard, for it to even be for sale. I know you don't have to put a for sale sign. You can list it. But if it's a high traffic area, wouldn't you think you want to put a for sale sign out there?
Yeah. I don't know.
You know? I really don't have anything else to say. I don't mean to be negative or anything like that. I'm just concerned with what's going on around there. Like I said, I've lived in Lawrence all my life. You know, I see the marsh shutting down, which is, I walked in there yesterday and turned around and walked back out, just broke my heart. You know, I'm not sure where I'm gonna go at this point. I tried the one down at Kroger at Fall Creek, and 82nd didn't quite fit in down there. But, you know, it just concerns me. You know, maybe work out something that maybe on their side, they could put up something more of a privacy fence. You know, and I'll put one across the back, and I gotta do some more fencing too. But, you know, it's just constant sirens, constant this, constant accidents. Just, you know, 56th Street is a main drag, and we all know what Salem Courthouse apartments have turned into. We all know what the old Orchard apartments have turned into. And it's just kind of disappointing that I haven't really seen that big of an effort for the house to be sold.
All right. We have to stay
Okay, that's
within our,
fine.
but I appreciate you.
All right, thank
And
you.
we'll take into consideration, sir. All right. At this time, we have any staff comments on behalf of the Department of Metropolitan Development.
Thank you. We are recommending denial of this petition.
State your name and what you
Uh,
represent, sir, please.
Larry Callaway, Department of Metropolitan Development, City of Indianapolis. We're recommending denial of this petition. Basically, I mean, it doesn't agree with the comprehensive plan, for one thing. It's, and secondly, we don't believe it's a proper way to develop along this corridor. I think the comment regarding the issue of the four corners, I don't see how you can look at this one small property in isolation. If you look at it, you're looking at four quadrants. And if you look at the development of those four quadrants, The northeast quadrant is developed with a school. The northwest quadrant is developed with a institutional use in multifamily. The southwest quadrant is developed with a variety of commercial uses. And the southeast quadrant is developed with residential uses. So this property itself, as one of many lots within that southeast quadrant, is not that unique, other than it's on a corner. There are other properties on the corner. It's on the most significant corner, but on the opposite corner of this residential area, there's also a signal, which has a lot of traffic because of the schools that are on the east side of that intersection to the east. So we think it's a significant difference when you have an entire quadrant developed in a commercial or institutional type manner versus taking what's basically a postage stamp lot and saying it's comparable because it happens to be at the corner. Well, the whole residential area is at that corner, not just this one lot. And encouraging this one lot to become commercial to us is an improper encroachment into that residential quadrant. And with respect to the type of uses that can go there, as was mentioned, the existing house can be torn down, and development can be new development can be erected there in compliance with the ordinance, unless, of course, they're granted variances to allow some deviations from that. Besides the office uses that could be permitted, just some of the more typical uses that, or at least the type of uses we get a lot of phone calls about in terms of is a site zone for this particular use. The uses that always that come up on almost a daily basis are a daycare facility, which would be permitted here. Another use that comes up a lot are hair care salons, beauty salons, barbershops, as well as one of the uses that falls into that category also is massage under that hair care salon type use. So those are the type of uses we'd expect to have in a site, zone C1, or the type of uses that most likely to occur besides offices. Then also, and in terms of those offices, you have a variety of types: the professional, medical, dental. Medical and dental can be a lot more intense than say a real estate office. And so it's all those type of concerns is why we don't think it's appropriate to take this one small little lot and say, hey, this can be C1, whether they're retaining the existing house or whether it's in the future demolished for a new building or new type of development to accommodate the use. And so, for those reasons, the noncompliance with the comprehensive plan, which recommends residential for this site as well as that whole southeast quadrant, and for the precedent set by establishing a commercial zone along the south side of 56th Street and encouraging the potential future conversion of the other residential properties to commercial designations in the future. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Any questions? Councilor Chabot.
Larry, in 2001 and 2005, I'm sorry, the ones that were before that were denied, I think it's important to know that this council votes yes or no, but it also then goes down to Indianapolis.
That's correct.
And so regardless of the representation on this body, Indianapolis has in the past chosen to do things differently. And so I'm curious, do you have the history of whether or not it went down to Indianapolis, or was it just stopped at this council and not pursued? Or do you have the history of why it was denied down in Indianapolis as well?
Well, all these, the previous petitions were all variances, and so they were all heard by the Lawrence Board of Zoning Appeals. None of those cases, there is a potential to appeal those to the Metropolitan Development Commission, but none of
They
those were
weren't.
appealed.
Okay.
So
That's what I was looking for.
now, with respect to this rezoning, it will go, to the Metropolitan Development Commission on May 17th, 2017. Unless the decision is appealed, it won't be heard. All they will do is vote on the recommendation of this body.
Okay.
Anyone else? Council Jones?
I actually really wanted to kind of repeat what he just said there as far as the vote, because I don't quite understand fully how the proceedings happen after this.
Okay, this body is serving as the first step in the rezoning process, and so the second step is that the petition will be forwarded to the Metropolitan Development Commission. If no one appeals the recommendation of the council, whether it's approval or denial, it will go on what's called their no appeals docket, and all they do is vote on the recommendation made by the council, and basically it's just a rubber stamp. That if the council recommends approval, they vote yes to continue that approval. If the council votes denial, then they vote yes to continue that denial. If the petitioner or remonstrator would appeal the case, then they would have a full hearing on the case, and it would be dealt with on a de novo basis. They're hearing it, from the start, and so, and then they vote approve or deny at that time.
Okay. I'd also have another question that kind of hit my mind, and it could be, I think it's legal. I think the place is a legal establishment, but I could be wrong. But up in the Keystone area, 70, right by the river, 70 something in Keystone by the Walmart. The area up that way. Can you get picture?
Generally, yes.
I used to go to a barber shop that was on a residential street across from from the Walmart. The house on the corner, 2 houses on the corner were residential. Houses across the street were residential. This house was maybe the third house from the corner. And it was clearly a salon, barbershop, had a lot, you drove into the driveway and it was definitely lotted that way, even had a sign out front. And so that's what makes me assume that it was legal. So, what made me think of that was when you were speaking of this particular property as a quadrant and not, look at it as a quadrant residential. That made me think of that was an example of a time that I have experienced a place that was commercially zoned with residential surrounding around it, really on a residential street. So, are there other examples throughout the city where that is something that does take place?
It's hard to say. It's possible there could be. It's possible that site could have a variance. People do apply for mid-block sort of deviations from the ordinance. They do occur occasionally, but they're not that typical. More typical is that it would be on the major street on Keystone where people would have variances approved or something like that.
And now think about it now, the barbershop I attend now is right behind Greater St. Mark's Church. It's on a residential street on the first house at the end of that parking lot. So I do think, for the record, that it is, I'm not saying it's typical, but there are examples throughout our community of businesses like that working within residential streets.
Now, the other thing also is that you can have a home occupation in certain situations if people actually live there and operate the salon as well.
It's a full barbershop owned by the church.
And then, well, if it's owned by the church and it's part of the church, then that's that's a whole different scenario.
It's not on a church lot, though. It's just like a house that the church
Well,
bought.
no, I understand that, but if it's zoned as part of the church, the church can have accessory uses beyond just, the religious activities.
Okay.
So again, it all depends on the circumstances. So
Okay.
it's hard to answer in a general question without looking at the specifics of the zoning, the history of the site, and et cetera.
Any more questions?
President Williams,
Concentrate.
just generally speaking, what impact does putting a C1 business in a residential neighborhood, what kind of impact does that have on the resale value of the residential properties, generally speaking?
Well, I mean, it can vary. Partly it depends on it depends on what the intended purposes of people that own the properties are. In some cases, it could potentially enhance people who want to sell the property for commercial purposes as well, because they see the precedent has been set, and so they try to that way. But on the other hand, when people are wanting to maintain a residence, they usually, at least testimony we've heard at hearings, is that they have trouble selling it if they're trying to sell it to someone or trying to make a deal, or they're selling it at a lower price than they anticipated. And that's due to either hours of operation and noise related to a business, and those sort of things, or just bad operators of the site. They don't keep their site tidy. There's always garbage. Things keep happening that are adverse to living in the neighborhood.
Any other councilors? All right, thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Holloway. All right, petitioner have 5 minutes for rebuttal. So we have someone from the city on the redevelopment. Do you have any comments, Mr. Stars? Cam?
Can, sure.
Okay. Okay.
Cam Starr in the city of Lawrence, and I think the petitioner mentioned that we did meet with at least counsel for the petitioner about this request and expressed that we don't have any concerns with what has been requested or with the grant of approval thereof. Given, and I think it's important to note that if this were a rezoning case to take this property from residential to a heavier commercial use, something that they could permit a drive-through or a gas station or a larger parking lot or a more intense use, then we would feel differently. But given the limited scope of the C1 rezoning that's been requested, we think that that's fitting given the what we would agree is a unique situation for that specific parcel on a high-traffic corner near a signalized intersection. I know I've personally driven by there numerous times and thought that would not be a very attractive place to live, and that would make it hard to attract a residential renter, certainly. But also, generally speaking, I think some flexibility in zoning in terms of reuse of property that's otherwise hard to market is good policy. But beyond that, again, I think the remonstrators' concerns are well taken, but I don't think that they have any sort of logical relation to the requested rezoning of this parcel to a limited C1 use. We don't see it becoming something that would be have much room to be a noisy or bad neighbor, really, given the relatively small size and the limited parking there. I think it's certainly a consideration that the building could be demolished and reconstructed, but it's unlikely, given the size of it, that it would support sort of a 5-story office building there that would bring a lot of additional traffic or activity to the area that would be negative. So even in that scenario, we don't see it moving in a very negative direction that would be a bad neighbor type of impact to an area that's already handles a lot of traffic in an intersection that's already quite busy. And in fact, I think some flexibility in zoning code can also promote more walkable areas so that you could have commercial that's more embedded in neighborhoods and doesn't require quite as much driving, that contributes to that traffic that goes down 56th Street, which carries 20 some odd thousand cars a day. And I think that's a positive thing in terms of quality of life. So those are the basic reasons, and especially given the limited scope of the requested rezoning that we have not, as the administration, written an official or formal opinion to submit. But I think Petitioner's Counsel did mention that we expressed to him that we don't have any large concerns should this council vote to approve the rezoning, and I think those are the reasons why.
Okay.
Any
All right.
questions on that?
Thank you, Mr. Thomas.
Thank you.
Petitioner, 5 minutes rebuttal.
Absolutely. Thank you,
And
Mr.
closing statement, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll be brief. Councilor Wells and Mr. Starnes both kind of addressed questions. I think some of the concerns related to some of the remonstrators' issues are some of the very issues that create the difficulty in utilizing this residentially on a long-term basis. And I didn't hear anything that were specific to this use or specific to this owner or specific to this proposed use that could be addressed. It has been utilized commercially under a variance since 2011. I didn't hear any issues, additional issues that were raised by that use during that time. Staff's indication of that this was about quadrants, I typically would agree with that very point. Here, however, you have one property in that residential quadrant that is bearing the brunt of all of those issues we talked about. It is the only property that fronts on two thoroughfares. It's the only property that's next to a signalized intersection. There are no other properties in that residential quadrant that are like this. And I think that's unique and needs to be considered for this encroachment. As it relates to questions Councilor Chavis asked about impact on property values, I can tell you do lots of zoning for lots of different clients around the state of Indiana. Often the concerns we hear about are related to intense commercial uses, gas stations being a major one. There are studies out there related to gas stations, to CVS's. I've seen some studies that's in proximity. 600 feet kind of seems to be the magic number to the extent there is any impact. But I've never seen anything on a relatively small, this is less than a half an acre of a site, so it would have a pretty small impact. As it relates to potential reconstruction, because there are protected districts next door to the south, to the east, and across the street, there are height limitations in the new zoning ordinance, which I believe are 25 feet at those transitional yards, so you couldn't have a 5-story structure located immediately adjacent to that transitional yard because you have height restrictions in the zoning ordinance. So I think, again, those are protections that are built into the zoning ordinance. We don't anticipate asking for those variances. We're not asking for those variances as it relates to this use. Our only variance requests relate to parking. So for those reasons, we believe this is an appropriate modification. Councilor Giles talked about some of those mid-block kind of uses. This is not mid-block. This is hard corner. This is different. Many of the uses that were provided by staff as examples of proposed uses, those are permitted home occupation uses. A daycare is a permitted home occupation use. If you live there, you could have a daycare. If you live there, you could have a nail salon. If you live there, you could have a barber shop. Here, we can't attract the person to live there. So we're asking for those uses to be allowed without somebody living there. For all those reasons, we think this is an appropriate request, given the unique nature of this property. We would ask for your favorable recommendation to the Metropolitan.
All right, thank you, Mr. Brown.
Thank you.
All right, we have 5 minutes for the rebuttal statement from the remonstrator. You have 5 minutes, sir, to say anything or anything in closing. You got 5 minutes to do so.
Just real quick, I understand where they're coming from. And like they said, the building could possibly be torn down. What is that going to do to my property value? Does everybody remember that 2 or 3 years ago, right there at that marathon station that I pick up half the trash out of my yard from, a teenager got shot and killed there. There's been multiple shootings. I just do not feel that this is the correct place to put a business. That's really all I had to say.
All right, sir, thank you.
Thanks.
All right, councilors, before you, you have your little ballot. Make sure you sign and date it, and then we'll move forward.
It's me first.
There were 7 ballots cast, 4 to grant and 3 to deny.
All right. Motion for rezoning hearing has been denied. We are adjourned at this time. As you were.
Passed.
It passed.
Passed?
Well, should there have been 5 though to grant?
Well, with the council's present. So we had 4 to 3, correct?
Mm-hmm.
For pass. So it's been approved.
Yeah, I don't know if you have to have a majority of the council or not. That I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know your rules on those. I mean, typically, Metropolitan Development Commission has rules as it relates to what their quorum requires, but I don't know. Larry, do you?
Okay, so as of right now, we have a vote for 43 to pass. So we would take that into consideration, and then we will, whatever needs to happen after this meeting, then we will follow up with that.
Okay.
That's the best way to handle this
That's
situation at
perfect.
this
That's
time.
perfect.
Thank you, Mr. Brown.
Thank you.
All right, so the variance has been granted at this time with the votes counted, and we will look further into from there going forward. At this time, are there any other questions? We are adjourned from the rezoning.